The story opens in a small cabin tucked into the rolling hills of southwestern Missouri. The year is around 1864, and the air still carries the deep fatigue of a nation torn by war. Inside that simple wooden home, a child is born into difficult circumstances, a boy named George. He comes into a world of shadow and uncertainty, but the land surrounding that cabin offers something else entirely. Beyond the door there are fields of tall prairie grass that sway like waves on a quiet sea, and a forest nearby where sunlight drifts down through the leaves in slow, lazy patterns. The boy is small and often unwell, so he cannot work the fields as others do. Instead, he walks out into the woods every morning as soon as the mist begins to lift, and he learns to listen. He feels the cool texture of moss on old stones, watches spider webs glisten with dew, and notices how certain plants grow only in particular patches of soil. This is his first classroom, and the earth is his gentle teacher. By the time he can walk steadily, the boy has already earned a quiet reputation among the people who know him. They call him the plant doctor, not with loud admiration, but with soft smiles and nods of respect. Neighbors will sometimes come to him carrying a drooping geranium or a sickly rose, their leaves spotted yellow and brown, and they ask for his help. He takes the suffering plant into his small hands, studies it carefully, and then digs into the soil around its roots. He might whisper something kind to it, not because he believes the plant understands words, but because speaking gently keeps his own mind calm and focused. Then he moves the plant to a different patch of earth, where the light is a little softer, and within weeks it stands upright again. There is no magic in this, only the patient observation of a child who spends every waking hour watching how water moves through soil and how shadows shift across the forest floor. But to those around him, it feels like a quiet kind of miracle. This childhood world is painted in greens and browns, with splashes of wildflower color in the spring. The boy walks barefoot along a narrow path that he has made himself, winding through blackberry thickets and past an old fallen log covered in velvety moss. He knows every tree by the feel of its bark, and he can tell you which mushrooms appear after a warm rain. There is a secret place, a hidden garden deep in the woods where no one else goes, and here he transplants the wildlings that he believes need special care. A bleeding heart with its delicate pink blossoms, a cluster of ferns that seem to be struggling near the creek bank, he brings them all to this shaded sanctuary. The light in this place has a tender, golden-green quality, filtering through layers of oak and hickory leaves, and it is so quiet that you can hear a single acorn drop to the ground. In this hidden garden the boy spends hours on his knees, his fingers gently pressing soil around tender roots, a morning breeze stirring the canopy overhead. This is his first laboratory, and it is as peaceful as a prayer. Education was not a simple path for a black child in Missouri during the years following the Civil War. There were no nearby schools that would welcome him, so his early learning came entirely from the natural world and from a single book that his guardian, a woman named Susan Carver, kept in the cabin. The boy learned to read by candlelight, tracing letters with his finger while the fire crackled softly in the hearth. But he hungered for more formal knowledge, so at around the age of 12 he set out on foot into the wider world. Imagine this slender boy walking away from the only home he had ever known, a small bundle over his shoulder, the dirt road stretching ahead into unknown territory. The sky above him was wide and pale blue, and the fields on either side were full of ripening wheat. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, stopping to examine wild plants along the roadside, always the plant doctor even on a journey of 100 miles. He eventually reached the town of Neosho, where a school for black children existed. He arrived tired and dusty, with little more than the clothes on his back, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. He found work doing household chores in exchange for a place to sleep and time to study. At night, after all his duties were done, he would sit by a small oil lamp and read whatever he could find: grammar books, almanacs, a tattered geography text. Outside his window, the town settled into darkness, the streets empty and quiet, only an occasional dog barking in the distance. The room was small and plain, but the lamp cast a warm, amber circle of light on his pages, and in that glow he traveled to places far beyond Missouri. This was the pattern of his early education, long stretches of quiet study broken by moves to new towns where different knowledge might be found. Over the next several years, George moved from place to place across Kansas and Missouri, doing laundry, cooking, and farm labor to support his learning. Each town brought a new teacher, a new library, a new plant to study. He was a quiet, watchful young man, never drawing much attention to himself, but always absorbing his surroundings. He played the accordion on quiet evenings and painted flowers with delicate brushstrokes, capturing their structure with a scientist's precision and an artist's tenderness. His paintings would later hang on walls, small windows into a world of botany seen through gentle eyes. In this wandering period, he learned the value of soil by seeing how different crops grew in different regions, and he began to dream of using that knowledge to help people. This dream was like a seed planted deep in his mind, still small and hidden, but beginning to send out tiny roots that would one day spread far across the American South. Eventually, his path led him to Iowa, where he enrolled at Simpson College to study art. It was a sun-drenched campus with brick buildings and broad lawns where students walked to class beneath tall elm trees. George drew flowers with such fine detail that his teacher recognized a scientific mind at work and urged him to transfer to Iowa State Agricultural College. There, in the discipline of botany and agricultural science, he found his true home. The campus was an ordered landscape of experimental plots and greenhouses, and he moved through it with a quiet sense of belonging. He walked between rows of corn and wheat, a notebook in hand, the morning light long and golden across the furrows. He was the first Black student at the college, and later the first Black faculty member, but the record books don't capture the feeling of those days, the cool touch of soil in the greenhouse, the musty smell of old herbarium sheets, the soft scratch of his pen as he sketched a cross-section of a soybean root. These were the years when the plant doctor became a scientist, not with any loud ceremony, but as quietly as a flower opening to the sun. In the year 1896, a letter traveled south through the American Postal Service, carrying a message that would change the course of agricultural history. It was written by Booker T. Washington, the principal of Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama, and it was addressed to George Washington Carver, asking him to come and build an agricultural department from the ground up. The letter itself was a quiet, paper-thin invitation, but it held the weight of a great need. The South was still recovering, and its soil was tired. Washington had a vision of a school that would not only educate the mind, but also teach the hands, a place where Black students could learn practical skills that would lift up entire communities. And he sensed that Carver, with his peculiar genius for plants and his patience born of the Missouri woods, was the man to lead this work. When Carver read that letter, he likely sat for a moment in the stillness of his Iowa greenhouse, surrounded by the humid scent of growing things, and understood that his wandering years had reached their purpose. The journey south was a long passage through changing landscapes. The train windows showed fields of corn giving way to cotton, the soil shifting from dark prairie richness to the exhausted red clay of the deep South. Carver would have watched this transformation with a scientist's eye, noticing the gullied hillsides and the thin, weary-looking crops. He arrived at the Tuskegee station on a warm Alabama afternoon, the air thick with the scent of pine and sun-warmed earth. The campus that greeted him was a cluster of red brick buildings rising from what had recently been a worn-out cotton field. Students had made the bricks themselves, shaping red Alabama clay with their own hands and firing them in kilns they had built. The walkways were unpaved, and everywhere there was the buzz of construction, but there was also a feeling of determined growth. Carver stepped off the train with a single suitcase and a few precious botanical specimens, a slender man with a high-pitched voice and eyes that missed nothing. His first laboratory was not a grand hall of science, but a small, humble room where he had to assemble his own equipment from whatever he could find. He walked through the surrounding woods and fields, picking up old bottles, bits of wire, discarded pans, and anything else that might be repurposed for scientific work. The students watched with curiosity as their new professor transformed junk into a functioning laboratory, heating substances over a makeshift burner, filtering liquids through cloth and carefully labeling every bottle in his meticulous handwriting. This was a lesson in itself, that knowledge does not require luxury, only dedication and a willingness to see the potential in humble things. In the evenings, the windows of that little laboratory glowed with warm yellow lamplight long after the rest of the campus had gone dark. Inside, Carver bent over his workbench, his shadow moving softly on the wall, the quiet click of glass vials the only sound. The landscape around Tuskegee was beautiful but troubled. Cotton fields stretched to the horizon in every direction, their white bowls like scattered clouds caught in the green undergrowth. But the soil beneath them was sick, drained of its vitality by decades of planting the same crop year after year without rest. Carver walked those fields often, sometimes alone and sometimes with students trailing behind him like a brood of curious ducklings. He would kneel down, scoop up a handful of earth, and let it run through his fingers, feeling its texture, smelling the absence of life in it. He explained to his students in his soft, reedy voice that the soil was a living thing, a community of tiny creatures and nutrients that had to be fed and cared for. When you took from it without giving back, you were like a person eating all their seed corn and expecting a harvest. The students listened, their faces serious, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the depleted furrows. Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver developed a working relationship that was complex and sometimes uneasy, but grounded in mutual respect for the mission of Tuskegee. Washington was an organization builder, a man of firm schedules and grand visions who wanted practical results that could be measured and reported to the school's donors. Carver was a dreamer of a different sort, a man who moved to the rhythm of sunlight and plant growth, sometimes losing himself for hours in the quiet study of a single specimen. Their offices were in the same building, and on sunny mornings you might see Washington striding purposefully down the hall, watch in hand, while Carver drifted along with a handful of wildflowers, his thoughts clearly far away. Yet they shared a deep belief that knowledge could heal, both people and land. Under this shared purpose, Carver's work took root and began to grow. Carver quickly understood that the first great challenge was to break the tyranny of King Cotton. For too long, Southern farmers had planted cotton exclusively because it was a cash crop that could be sold. But cotton is a demanding plant, pulling nitrogen and minerals from the soil and giving nothing back. The result, after decades, was what he saw on his walks: erosion, poverty, and a landscape that looked tired. In his laboratory, he began to study alternative crops that could restore the soil while also providing food and income for farmers. He experimented with sweet potatoes, which grew well in the warm southern climate and were packed with nutrition. He worked with soybeans, a legume that could actually feed the soil with nitrogen rather than depleting it. And he focused with particular intensity on a humble, knobby legume that many people at the time associated more with animal feed than human tables: the peanut. The campus of Tuskegee offered a living canvas for his ideas. He convinced Washington to let him establish an experimental station, a small farm where different crop rotations could be tested and demonstrated. This was not a grand establishment, but a practical working plot, with neat rows of peanuts and sweet potatoes alternating with strips of cowpeas and soybeans. Carver could often be found there in the early morning, before the Alabama heat grew heavy, walking between the rows with a notebook and a pencil tucked behind his ear. The rising sun would catch the dew on the broad leaves of the sweet potato vines, turning each droplet into a tiny, shimmering mirror of the sky. Students came to work these plots, learning the rhythm of sustainable farming through direct experience. This season peanuts to fix the nitrogen, next season cotton to use it, then a season of rest under a cover crop of clover. It was simple, peaceful work, and it held within it the seeds of a revolution. The heart of George Washington Carver's world at Tuskegee was a room that he filled with the gentle clutter of a lifetime of inquiry. By day, sunlight streamed through tall windows onto a worktable crowded with glass jars, soil samples, dried plants pressed between sheets of newspaper, and notebooks filled with his neat, careful script. The air in this room carried a mixture of smells: the musty sweetness of old paper, the earthy scent of clay and loam, the faint chemical tang of simple laboratory reagents. On the walls hung his own botanical paintings, watercolors of sweet potato blossoms and peanut plants, each petal and leaf rendered with such delicate precision that they seemed almost to breathe. This laboratory was not a place of harsh electric light and sterile surfaces. It was a workshop of natural philosophy, warm and intimate, where the boundary between science and art dissolved like sugar in warm tea. Carver rose every morning before dawn, a habit he had never broken since his boyhood in the Missouri woods. In the quiet hours before the campus stirred, he would walk out into the fields to gather specimens, his long fingers gently plucking leaves and stems that he would later examine under his microscope. He spoke to the plants as he walked, not in full sentences, but in soft murmurs of greeting and gratitude, the way one might speak to an old friend. He believed deeply that the natural world was a gift to be explored with patience and reverence, and that every weed, every fungus, every overlooked wildflower held secrets waiting to be discovered. By the time the chapel bell rang for morning prayers, he had already filled a small basket with specimens and was padding quietly back to his laboratory, the hem of his old tweed jacket damp with dew. His work with peanuts began as an answer to a practical problem. What could Southern farmers do with all these legumes they were being asked to grow? But it quickly blossomed into an obsession of the most creative kind. Carver brought peanuts into his laboratory by the sackful, emptying them onto his work table with a soft rattle of shells, and then he simply began to play. This is a word we do not often associate with science, but play is the right word here. He would shell the peanuts, crush them, press their oil, grind them into meal, roast them, boil them, and mix them with every other substance he could think of, just to see what would happen. He was like a composer at a piano, trying one chord after another, listening carefully for a harmony that no one had heard before. And slowly, from this patient, playful experimentation, an astonishing catalog of uses began to emerge. He discovered that peanuts could yield a rich, stable oil suitable for cooking, for cosmetics, for soap, and even for massage therapy. He found ways to turn peanut protein into a nutritious flour and a substitute for meat. He created peanut-based milk that was creamy and wholesome, cheeses and butters that could be spread on bread, and a host of industrial products, stains for wood, dyes for cloth, insulating boards, and rubber compounds. Each discovery was recorded in the bulletins that he published, slim pamphlets written in simple, clear language that any farmer could understand. The bulletins themselves were works of humble art, sometimes printed on the campus press and distributed by hand. They had titles like How to Grow the Peanut and 105 Ways of Preparing It for Human Consumption, and they became, in time, a lifeline for rural families across the South. The sweet potato received the same devoted attention. Carver showed that this orange-fleshed root, so easy to grow in the warm southern soil, could be transformed into more than 100 different products. He made flour from dried sweet potatoes, a flour that could be used to bake bread and cakes with a distinctive golden hue and a gentle sweetness. He created molasses, vinegar, starch, and even a type of synthetic rubber from sweet potato derivations. In his laboratory, the sweet potato was not just a food, it was a raw material, a chemical factory in tuber form, waiting to be unlocked by a patient mind. He would demonstrate these transformations for visiting farmers, his hands moving skillfully from grater to pot to strainer, all the while explaining in his gentle voice the chemistry of what was happening. The farmers sat on wooden benches, wide-eyed, watching this wizardry with quiet amazement. Not everything happened in the laboratory. Carver was also an artist in residence wherever he worked, and he believed that beauty was as essential as bread. On Sunday afternoons, he often led his students on nature walks through the Alabama countryside, pointing out the colors and structures of wildflowers, the intricate architecture of seed pods, the way light played differently on the surfaces of different leaves. These walks were unhurried and contemplative, a kind of moving meditation. The students learned to see the world more deeply, to notice the small miracles that surrounded them every day. Carver would stop to sketch something particularly lovely, his pencil moving with quick, sure strokes, capturing the curve of a petal or the vein pattern on a leaf. He told them that nature was the greatest teacher, and that a person who could truly see a flower would never be lonely or bored. These afternoons in the Alabama woods, with their dappled sunlight and quiet conversation, were among the most cherished memories of many who studied under him. The experimental station continued to grow, and by the early 1900s it had become a model for what regenerative agriculture could look like. Carver demonstrated that by rotating cotton with peanuts, cowpeas, and sweet potatoes, farmers could restore the fertility of their land and simultaneously produce enough food to feed their families. The test plots at Tuskegee were no longer just educational tools. They were proof, written in healthy green leaves and plump roots, that the drift toward agricultural ruin could be reversed. Visitors came from across the region to see these fields, to walk down the neat rows and touch the rich, dark soil that had been restored by legumes. Carver would meet them in his gentle way, not like a professor lecturing, but like a neighbor sharing good news. The afternoon sun would angle across the plots, catching the purple blooms of the cowpeas and the broad, heart-shaped leaves of the sweet potato vines, and everything looked peaceful and possible. Knowledge, George Washington Carver understood, is only valuable if it reaches the people who need it. The farmers of rural Alabama and the wider South could not always afford to travel to Tuskegee, nor could they leave their fields for days at a time to attend lectures. Carver saw this problem and, as he so often did, he found a solution not in grand buildings, but in something small and mobile. In 1906, he helped design and equip what came to be known as the Jesup Agricultural Wagon, a simple horse-drawn cart loaded with demonstration materials, soil samples, seeds, and a few pieces of portable scientific equipment. This wagon was essentially a traveling schoolroom, a classroom on wheels that could roll right into a farmer's barnyard. The name came from Morris K. Jesup, a New York philanthropist who funded the modest project, but the soul of the wagon belonged entirely to Carver and his determination to take learning directly to the land. The wagon itself was a thing of practical beauty. Built of sturdy wood and painted a clean, unassuming color, it rolled on large wheels designed to handle rutted country roads. When its sides were lowered, they became display tables showing the results of crop rotation experiments, bundles of healthy peanut plants next to jars of peanut oil, and neat stacks of sweet potato flour. The driver, usually a young extension agent trained by Carver, would pull into a crossroads community or a cluster of farmhouses, and word would spread quickly. By late morning, farm families would gather around the wagon, the men in patched overalls and the women in cotton dresses with their hair tied up in kerchiefs, children peering curiously from behind their mothers' skirts. There was no admission fee, no required reading, only the open air and the quiet voice of the teacher explaining how this new way of farming could make their lives better. The scenes around these wagons are some of the most tender in the history of American agriculture. Picture a wide, flat field under a soft, overcast sky that tames the harsh southern heat. The wagon is parked beneath the spreading branches of a live oak tree, its leaves casting a shifting lace of shadow on the ground. A dozen farmers sit on upturned crates or on the grass itself, listening as the extension agent demonstrates how to test soil composition using nothing more than a jar, some water, and a bit of patience. Nearby, a woman rubs a pinch of peanut flour between her fingers, marveling at its fine texture, while her husband nods along as the benefits of rotating crops are explained. There is no hurry in these gatherings. The pace is slow and conversational, respectful of the rhythms of farm life. The world smells of sun-warmed wood and crushed grass, and the only sounds are the low murmur of voices, the occasional snort of a horse, and the distant call of a meadowlark. Carver did not always ride on the wagon himself, but his spirit rode with it everywhere it went. He trained the agents who operated these mobile schools, instilling in them his philosophy of teaching. Never talk down to a farmer, always start with what the farmer already knows, and let the demonstration speak louder than any lecture. The agents learned to carry themselves with humility and patience, to answer the same questions again and again without frustration, and to leave behind small printed bulletins that could be read by lantern light in the evening. These bulletins, written in Carver's straightforward prose, included simple recipes and instructions. How to make peanut butter with a hand grinder. How to prepare a nutritious sweet potato soup. How to build a simple compost pile from kitchen scraps and leaves. Each pamphlet was a small seed of practical wisdom, planted in a home where it might grow into better health and modest prosperity. The boll weevil, a small beetle that had been creeping across the cotton belt from Texas, became an unexpected ally in Carver's mission. By the mid-1910s, this insect had reached Alabama and was devastating cotton crops, leaving fields of brown, withered stalks where white bolls had once swayed. Farmers who had been reluctant to abandon their single-crop dependence were suddenly desperate for alternatives. Carver met this crisis with calm resolve, stepping up his outreach and emphasizing the very crops he had been promoting for years. The Jesup Wagon became more than an educational tool, it became a lifeline. Farmers who had lost everything to the weevil found that by planting peanuts and sweet potatoes they could feed their families and even earn some cash. The catastrophe, terrible as it was, opened ears that had been previously deaf to his message, and the landscape of Southern agriculture began its slow, steady shift toward diversity. Over time, the single wagon multiplied. Other mobile schools were built, and the idea spread to different parts of the South, carrying Carver's teachings across hundreds of miles of rural terrain. The wagons trundled along dusty red roads, past fields of cotton being pulled up and replanted with legumes, through small towns where the general store began stocking peanut products alongside the usual supplies. Each wagon was a moving point of light, bringing not just information but also hope, a sense that the tired old ways could be left behind for something kinder to both the land and the people who lived on it. The extension agents kept records of their travels, and those ledgers, filled with careful notations about miles covered and farmers reached, are a testament to thousands of quiet encounters, each one a seed planted in the soil of a human mind. The Jesup Wagon program represented something profound about Carver's approach to science and humanity. He did not believe in knowledge that stayed locked in university lecture halls or written in dense academic language. Knowledge, to him, was like water. It naturally wanted to flow downhill to the places where it was needed most. The wagon was the channel he dug for that water, allowing it to reach the smallest, most isolated farms. In the final accounting, this may have been his greatest invention, a method of teaching that respected the dignity of the learner, that showed up at the farm gate with a gentle knock rather than a commanding shout. Long after the wheels of the last wagon creaked to a stop, the principle behind it continued to inspire agricultural extension services across the nation. And the image of that simple cart beneath a live oak tree remains one of the most enduring and peaceful symbols of his life's work. George Washington Carver's life was not untouched by the hardships of his time. The world outside his laboratory was often troubled by prejudice and inequality, and he walked through that world every day with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any protest. He was a small, slender man with a high, gentle voice, and he dressed simply, often in the same worn jacket until it was nearly threadbare. He refused to engage in anger or bitterness, not because he did not see the injustice around him, but because he believed that his greatest contribution to the struggle for racial dignity would be the excellence of his work and the breadth of his compassion. He once said that he would never allow anyone to narrow and degrade his soul by making him hate them, words that have been quoted many times, but that carried the full weight of lived experience. In his gentle way, he became a symbol of what patient, persistent goodness could accomplish against all odds. His fame grew gradually, like a tree adding rings, until by the 1920s and 1930s his name was known across the nation and even overseas. He received awards and invitations, visited universities and addressed conventions, yet he remained deeply rooted in his simple Tuskegee routine. He still rose before the sun. He still walked through the dew to collect his specimens. He still worked in his laboratory until late in the evening, surrounded by the quiet clutter of his beloved jars and plants. When dignitaries came to campus to meet him, they often found him not in a formal office, but in the greenhouse or the experimental plot, his hands covered in soil and a gentle smile on his face. He would apologize for the dirt under his nails and then launch into an enthusiastic explanation of his latest experiment, his voice soft but brimming with excitement. The Great Depression brought new urgency to his work. As poverty tightened its grip on the rural South, Carver redoubled his efforts to teach self-sufficiency through the soil. He created new bulletins focused on home canning, on replacing expensive store-bought products with homemade alternatives derived from peanuts and sweet potatoes, on making do with what the land provided. His laboratory became less a place of pure research and more a workshop for survival. He showed families how to make their own dyes from clay, their own paints from natural pigments, their own medicines from common weeds. In these dark economic years, his voice, always calm, always gentle, came through the radio waves into farmhouses across the South, a reassuring presence reminding people that the earth was still generous if treated with care. The glowing dial of a family's radio set, tuned to his soft-spoken address, was a small beacon of hope in a time of great need. Soybeans emerged as another pillar of his agricultural revolution. Although soybeans had been grown in Asia for thousands of years, they were relatively new to American farms. Carver saw in this legume the same soil-building qualities he loved in the peanut, plus a remarkable versatility that could address both human and animal nutrition. He developed methods for turning soybeans into milk, cheese, flour, and oil, and he advocated for their integration into the Southern crop rotation cycle. The fields at Tuskegee soon included robust rows of soybean plants, their fuzzy green pods ripening into golden brown under the summer sun. Students learned to harvest and process them, boiling the beans into nutritious stews and pressing them for their light, clean oil. The soybean work was quieter and less publicized than the peanut discoveries, but it added another thread to the tapestry of sustainable agriculture that Carver was weaving, one plant at a time. Carver's relationship with Henry Ford, the automobile magnate, is one of the more curious footnotes in his life. The two men, so different in their backgrounds and temperaments, developed a genuine friendship based on a shared interest in finding industrial uses for agricultural products. Ford was fascinated by Carver's ability to extract plastics, fuels, and synthetic materials from plants. They exchanged letters and gifts, and Ford even built a small laboratory for Carver at his Georgia estate. There is a photograph of the two of them, the elderly black scientist and the wealthy white industrialist, standing side by side in an experimental garden, both wearing hats and looking at something growing in the soil. The image is remarkable for its quiet ordinariness. Two men, both curious, both old, sharing a moment of botanical wonder. In the context of the segregated South, this friendship was a subtle but powerful statement about the unifying force of honest inquiry. Throughout all these decades, Carver never forgot the poor farmers whose lives he was trying to improve. He kept a collection of letters in his desk, letters from sharecroppers and smallholders who had followed his advice and wanted to thank him. Some were written on cheap paper in shaky handwriting, others dictated to a literate relative, but all of them expressed a simple, profound gratitude. They told of children who gained weight on peanut milk, of a cotton field that yielded a good harvest for the first time in 10 years, of a woman who earned a few extra dollars selling her homemade sweet potato flour. Carver treasured these letters more than any award or honorary degree. They were, to him, the true measure of a life's work, not fame or fortune, but the quiet testimony of lives made a little easier, a little healthier, a little more hopeful. In his later years, Carver became an elder statesman of science, though he never behaved like one. He spoke with presidents and congressmen, advised on agricultural policy, and was celebrated in newspapers and magazines. Yet on any given day, you might still find him in his laboratory, showing a young student how a microscope worked, his long, graceful fingers adjusting the focus, while the student squinted with fascination. The room would be filled with the same soft, honey-colored light that had illuminated it for decades, the same shelves of tinctures and powders, the same delicate watercolors of flowers. Outside the window, the agricultural plots he had planted years ago continued their quiet cycles of growth and renewal. The peanut plants sent their small yellow flowers into the air, then pushed pegs down into the soil to form their fruit underground. It was a humble, hidden process, full of mystery and patience, and no one understood it better than the man who had spent a lifetime learning from the earth. As the 1930s drew toward their close, George Washington Carver was an old man, but his spirit remained as green and growing as ever. His body had grown thinner, his voice perhaps a little softer, but the curiosity that had propelled him from a Missouri cabin to international fame still burned with a clear, steady flame. He continued to teach, to write, to putter in his laboratory, and to receive the stream of visitors who made the pilgrimage to Tuskegee to meet him. The campus had changed around him over the decades, more buildings, more students, more trees that he himself had planted reaching their full, spreading maturity. He would walk slowly now, sometimes leaning on a cane, but he still walked every day out among the experimental plots and the greenhouses, touching leaves and smelling the soil. There was a sense, among those who knew him best, that he was gradually becoming part of the landscape he had loved and tended for so long. The Carver Museum, which he helped establish on campus in the 1930s, became a repository of his life's work. Inside this modest, brick building, the collections were arranged with his characteristic care: pressed plant specimens in glass-fronted cabinets, jars of peanut oil and sweet potato starch, samples of the paints and dyes he had made from natural materials, and many of his exquisite botanical paintings. The museum was never crowded or noisy. It was a quiet sanctuary where a student might come to sit and absorb the gentle atmosphere of a life devoted to inquiry. Light filtered in through the windows onto polished wooden floors, and there was often a vase of fresh flowers on a small table near the entrance, flowers from the very fields Carver had taught others to cultivate. He sometimes visited the museum himself, not as a celebrity but as a quiet caretaker, straightening a label or dusting a display case, his movements slow and reverent. In these final years, Carver spent more time in simple reflection. He rose still before dawn, but now he often sat for a while in an old armchair in his room, watching the light change through the window as the sun came up over the Alabama woods. He had lived a life of extraordinary productivity, but he never boasted of his achievements. When asked about his work, he would often deflect the praise, saying that his discoveries were not his own but had been shown to him by the plants themselves, by the great Creator, by the patient observation of a world that was always speaking if only humans would quiet their minds enough to listen. This was not false modesty but a deep, genuine belief that he was merely a channel for truths that had existed since the beginning of time. This humility was as natural to him as breathing, and it gave others permission to sit with him in comfortable silence, without the need for grand words. The peanut had, by this time, become almost synonymous with his name. The two words, Carver and peanut, were linked in the public mind as tightly as any inventor and invention. Yet he never grew tired of the little legume. In fact, he would sometimes hold up a peanut to a classroom full of students and speak about it with such tender admiration that the students saw it transformed before their eyes, no longer a humble snack, but a marvel of biological design. A tiny package of protein and oil and potential wrapped in a thin, veined shell. He would talk about the way the peanut flower pollinated itself, the way it sent a peg downward after fertilization to bury its fruit in the soil, the way it slowly matured in the warm darkness underground. It was a story of patience and hidden growth, and in telling it, Carver was telling the story of his own life. On January 5, 1943, George Washington Carver died at Tuskegee, quietly, in the place that had been his home for nearly half a century. The news spread slowly through the campus and then outward into the world, carried by telegraph wires and radio broadcasts. Flags were lowered, and tributes came from every corner of the nation. But the truest memorial was not in the headlines or the official proclamations. It was in the millions of peanut plants growing in fields across the South, their roots fixing nitrogen into soil that had once been dead. It was in the sweet potato slips being set out in family gardens, in the soybean fields ripening under the sun, in the quiet kitchen tables where a mother prepared a nutritious meal from ingredients Carver had championed. The monument to his life was a living, growing thing, and it continues to grow to this day. The funeral was simple, in keeping with the man. He was buried on the Tuskegee campus beneath a simple headstone, near the laboratory where he had spent so many hours. The ceremony was held outdoors, under a sky the color of pale blue silk, with a gentle breeze stirring the branches of the trees. Those who spoke recalled not his scientific achievements so much as his unfailing gentleness, his kindness to students, his humble wonder at the beauty of a flower. Afterwards, people walked quietly back to their daily tasks, carrying with them the memory of a man who had touched their lives. The laboratory windows, now dark, overlooked the fields that still grew with his crops, and as evening came on, the soft golden light of the Alabama sunset fell across the red brick and the green leaves, just as it had in all the years he had worked there. In the decades since his passing, Carver's legacy has taken root in profound ways. The principles of crop rotation and sustainable agriculture that he championed are now fundamental to modern farming, even if the specific crops have changed. The concept of agricultural extension, taking knowledge from universities to working farmers, is now a permanent part of the American agricultural system, embodied in county agents and experimental stations across the nation. The peanut industry, which he helped launch with his research into new uses and markets, has grown into a multi-billion-dollar sector that supports thousands of families. But perhaps his deepest legacy lies in the countless individuals who were inspired by his example to see science not as a cold, mechanical pursuit, but as a warm, creative, and deeply human act of love. So the story draws to a close, not with a loud climax, but with the slow fade of evening. The Tuskegee experimental fields have been turned, the last of the peanuts harvested, the sweet potato vines gone golden and dry with the autumn. A single light glows in the window of the old laboratory, maybe just a lantern left by a caretaker, maybe the ghost of memory itself. The great live oaks stand still and patient, their branches silhouetted against a sky full of stars. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blows, the same sound that once carried a young George Washington Carver into a new life. The soil rests beneath a blanket of fallen leaves, rich and dark and ready for spring. And in that fertile darkness, as in the quiet mind of the sleeping world, everything is being made new.